The year was 1832, a time when the American frontier held both promise and peril. In the untamed wilderness of the Cumberland Gap, courage was measured by survival and compassion was as rare as gold. This is the extraordinary tale of Elizabeth Morgan, a woman who lost her sight but found her strength, and James Redhawk, a Cherokee scout who saw beyond the boundaries that divided their worlds. Abandoned, vulnerable, and facing certain death, Elizabeth's journey became a testament to human resilience and the unexpected bonds that form in the darkest of times. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1832 wore a deceptive beauty in the Appalachian wilderness. Trees blazed with crimson and gold, but beneath their splendor, winter's cold breath was already creeping through the valleys. The woodland floor crackled with fallen leaves. As the wagon train began its slow crawl westward, wheels grinding against stone and root, Elizabeth Morgan sat rigid on the edge of her wagon bed, her fingers tracing the worn wooden planks beneath her. Though her eyes were open, they registered nothing but shadows and light, the lingering remnants of vision that fever had left her 3 years prior. At 32, she had learned to navigate her darkness with quiet dignity, relying on her other senses to build a map of the world around her. "We make camp at Clearwater Creek tonight," called Mason Fletcher, the caravan leader. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. 2 days more to Cumberland settlement if the weather holds. Elizabeth felt for her water, skin, bringing it to her lips. The liquid was tepid and tasted of the leather container, but it soothed her parched throat. The journey had been harder than any had anticipated, supplies dwindling, tempers fraying with each passing mile. She was acutely aware of the whispers that followed her. The blind woman, the burden. Her cousin's husband, William Pierce, had made no secret of his resentment at being saddled with her care after her parents' deaths last winter. The Pierces had only taken her in for the land she'd inherited, land they'd promptly sold before joining the westward migration. Now that her usefulness had ended, their tolerance wore thinner by the day. "Elizabeth," Rebecca Pierce's voice cut through her thoughts, tight with poorly concealed frustration. "The water barrel is nearly empty again. Did you take more than your share?" "No, Rebecca, just the morning ration," Elizabeth replied, keeping her voice even despite the familiar sting of accusation. "Well, someone has, and we've miles to go before the next stream." Rebecca's skirts rustled as she moved away, leaving the scent of dried lavender and simmering resentment in her wake. The wagon lurched forward, and Elizabeth steadied herself against the jolt. Her fingers found the small bundle beside her. All she had left in the world. A change of clothes, a bone comb, her father's pocket watch that no longer ticked, and her mother's Bible with its raised lettering that she could trace in the quiet hours when sleep evaded her. By late afternoon, the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Elizabeth could smell it, that peculiar metallic scent that preceded a storm. The caravan's pace quickened, desperate to reach the shelter of the creek's tree line before the downpour began. "Storm's coming fast," a voice called from the lead. "Wagon." Might be worse than we thought. The first fat droplets struck Elizabeth's face as the wagons groaned to a halt. Around her, chaos erupted. Men shouting orders, women gathering children, the frightened whinnies of horses sensing the changing. Pressure. She stayed where she was, knowing she would only be in the way if she tried to help. "Get the tents secured," Fletcher bellowed. "Tie down anything that might blow away." Lightning split the sky, illuminating Elizabeth's world in a flash of white that even her damaged eyes could perceive. Thunder followed immediately, shaking the ground beneath the wagons. The storm had arrived with a vengeance. "The creek's rising," someone shouted in alarm. "We need to move to higher ground." Water sluiced beneath the wagon, and Elizabeth felt a surge of panic. She reached for her bundle and clutched it to her chest. "Rebecca!" she called out. "William!" Only the roar of the storm answered her. Cold water began to seep through the floorboards, soaking the hem of her dress. Elizabeth moved toward the front of the wagon, feeling her way carefully. "Is anyone there?" she called again, louder this time. A hand grasped her arm roughly, pulling her forward. "Move!" William's voice sharp with fear. "The wagons are flooding. Everyone's heading for the ridge." He half dragged her through the mud, her boots slipping on the slick ground. The rain was a solid wall of water, disorienting even to those who could see. Elizabeth stumbled, fell to her knees, felt the cold mud soak through her skirts. "Get up!" William yanked her to her feet. "I swear, Elizabeth, you're more trouble than—" His words cut off as another crack of thunder split the air. They struggled upward, the incline growing steeper. Elizabeth's lungs burned with effort, her free hand clutching her precious bundle, while William pulled her forward by the other arm. The sounds of the caravan, shouting voices, crying children, frightened animals, grew fainter, lost in the storm's fury or distance, she couldn't tell which. "Wait here," William ordered suddenly, pressing her against what felt like the rough bark of a tree. "I need to help Fletcher with the horses. Don't move an inch." His presence vanished before she could respond. Elizabeth stood perfectly still, rain cascading down her face, her back pressed against the tree's solidity. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The storm's intensity began to wane, the thunder now a distant grumble rather than an earth-shaking roar. "William?" she called hesitantly. Then, louder, "Rebecca? Anyone from the caravan?" Only the diminishing patter of rain and the drip of water from leaves answered her. Dread pooled in her stomach, colder than the rain that had soaked her to the skin. She had been abandoned. Elizabeth slid down the trunk until she sat on the sodden ground, her bundle clutched to her chest. The enormity of her situation crashed over her. Blind, alone, in wilderness she could not navigate, with no shelter, little food, and no means to make fire. If the elements didn't claim her, predators surely would. As darkness fell, not that it made much difference to her world of shadows, the temperature dropped sharply. Elizabeth's wet clothes clung to her skin, drawing heat from her body. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. She thought of moving, trying to find the caravan, but in her blindness each step risked a deadly fall down the unfamiliar slope or into a ravine she couldn't see. "So this is how it ends," she whispered to herself, a strange calm settling over her despite the circumstances. There was almost relief in the finality of it. No more pitying glances she couldn't see but could feel. No more being the burden, the afterthought, the problem to be solved. The night deepened around her. Insects resumed their chorus after the storm, and somewhere in the distance an owl called, 3 short hoots that echoed through the trees. Elizabeth leaned her head back against the trunk, exhaustion pulling at her. She should try to stay. Awake, she knew, but the cold made her limbs heavy, her thoughts sluggish. Just as her consciousness began to slip away, another sound cut through the night. Deliberate footsteps approaching through the underbrush. Not the heavy tread of William, or any of the caravan men. These steps were lighter, more measured, as if the walker knew exactly how to place each foot for maximum silence. Elizabeth froze, hardly daring to breathe. Bear? Wolf? Or something worse? Someone who might wish her harm? She had heard stories of renegades who preyed on vulnerable travelers, tales whispered around campfires that she was never meant to hear. The footsteps paused. She could feel a presence nearby, watching her. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain it could be heard. Then a voice spoke, deep and clear, with an accent she had never heard before. "You are far from your people, blind one." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She turned her face toward the voice, her useless eyes wide with fear and desperate hope. "They left me," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The storm came, and they left me. A moment of silence followed, heavy with judgment not for her, but for those who had abandoned her. Then the stranger spoke again. Night comes, cold deepens. You will die here alone. It wasn't a threat, merely a statement of fact, delivered with the same dispassionate certainty as one might remark on approaching rain or the setting sun. I know, Elizabeth replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Another silence, then the rustle of movement as the stranger crouched beside her. She could sense his proximity, smell leather and smoke, and something herb-like on his clothes. I am called Thomas Black Fox by those who trade with my people. The Cherokee know me as Waya Unol, Quiet Wolf. The voice held neither pity nor promise. What are you called, blind women of the white settlers? Elizabeth Morgan, she answered, turning her face toward the sound of his voice. And I don't want to die in these woods. Can you stand? Thomas Black Fox asked, his voice betraying no emotion. Elizabeth nodded, struggling to her feet with limbs stiffened by cold and fear. Her fingers clutched her small bundle of possessions as if it were a lifeline to the world she had lost. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The storm has passed, but your people have gone, Thomas continued. They traveled north along the ridge, too far now to reach before dawn. Elizabeth swallowed hard, forcing back the wave of despair that threatened to engulf her. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made her abandonment real. They didn't look. For me, she asked, though she already knew the answer. One man called your name 3 times, Thomas replied evenly. Then another spoke, said you had probably fallen into the creek. The woman cried, but they continued on. William, Rebecca, fulfilling only the barest obligation of conscience before leaving her to die. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. They never intended to find me. Thomas made a sound that might have been an agreement. Night grows colder. We cannot stay here. We. Elizabeth turned her face toward his voice, surprise evident in her sightless eyes. Unless you prefer to remain, he answered, a hint of wry humor in his otherwise serious tone. A humorless laugh escaped her. I prefer to live. Then we go. My shelter is not far, but the path is difficult. Can you follow? Elizabeth hesitated. Everything she had been taught warned against trusting a stranger, especially one from a tribe white settlers often regarded with suspicion. But what choice did she have? I can follow your voice, she said finally. But I cannot see where to place my feet. Thomas was silent for a moment, considering. Give me your hand, he said at last. Elizabeth reached out tentatively, her hand wavering in the space between them. Warm, calloused fingers wrapped around her wrist, not roughly as William had done, but with firm, steady pressure. I will guide. You tell me when you tire, or when the path becomes too difficult. They set off through the forest, moving at a deliberate pace. Thomas walked slightly ahead of her, his grip on her wrist maintaining just enough tension to communicate direction and obstacles. When a fallen log blocked their path, he guided her hand to feel its height. When the ground dipped suddenly, his grip tightened in warning. The storm has changed the land, he explained, helping her navigate a section where mudslide treacherously beneath their feet. Water carves new paths through soil. What was safe yesterday may not be safe today. Elizabeth stumbled once, her breath catching as her foot slipped on wet leaves. Thomas steadied her instantly, his other hand catching her elbow. Thank you, she murmured, embarrassed by her helplessness yet grateful for his patience. They continued in silence for a time, the forest alive with night sounds around them, the distant call of a whippoorwill, the rustle of small creatures. In the underbrush, the steady drip of rainwater from laden branches. "How did you lose your sight?" Thomas asked suddenly, his voice breaking the rhythm of their journey. Elizabeth's lips pressed together, the memory still painful despite the passage. "Of time. Fever, 3 summers past. It took my parents and left me in darkness." She didn't add how quickly childhood friends had fallen away, how potential suitors had vanished, how her life had narrowed to dependence on reluctant relatives. "The fever that burns the eyes." Thomas nodded, though she couldn't see it. "We have known this sickness too." His words held no pity, which Elizabeth found strangely comforting. Pity was a burden heavier than blindness itself. The terrain changed beneath her feet, from the soft give of forest floor to a harder, rockier surface. The air shifted too, cooler with the scent of water nearby. "We follow the stream now," Thomas explained. "It leads to where I have made camp." "You don't live with your people?" Elizabeth asked, curiosity momentarily distracting her from her discomfort. A lengthy pause followed. "I travel between worlds," he finally said. "Scout for the Cherokee, guide for white settlers when they pay well, trusted by both, belonging to neither." The complexity in those simple words struck Elizabeth deeply. Here was someone who understood isolation, though of a different kind than hers. "Your English is very good," she observed. "Mission school until I was 12, he replied. "Then 5 years with a trader from Virginia who needed someone who spoke Cherokee and Creek. And now you're helping a blind woman through the wilderness," Elizabeth said, unable to keep a hint of bitter humor from her voice. "Surely not what you planned for this night." "Plans are for those who believe they control the path ahead," Thomas said, something like amusement warming his voice. "I have learned to follow the trail that opens before me." They walked in silence again, Elizabeth concentrating on keeping her footing on the increasingly rocky ground beside the stream. The rush of water grew louder surrounding them. "We cross here," Thomas announced, stopping suddenly. "The water is not deep, but the stones are slippery. I will carry you." Before Elizabeth could protest, he had taken her bundle and secured it somewhere on his person. Then strong arms lifted her effortlessly, one behind her back, the other beneath. Her knees. She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, startled by the sudden proximity. Thomas stepped into the stream, his movements careful but confident as he navigated the crossing. Elizabeth could feel the tensing of his muscles as he balanced on submerged stones, the slight adjustments he made when one shifted beneath his weight. The water gurgled around them, its cold spray occasionally touching her face. "We have crossed," he informed her as he set her gently on her feet on the opposite bank. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks despite the cool night air. It had been years since anyone had carried her, treated her with such considerate strength. They continued on, the ground beginning to slope upward. The forest, sounds changed subtly, fewer insects, more wind through branches. Elizabeth sensed they were climbing toward more exposed terrain. "The shelter is ahead," Thomas said after they had climbed in silence for several minutes. "A cave in the hillside, small but dry." "How did you find me?" Elizabeth asked, the question that had been nagging at her finally breaking free. "Of all the places in these woods, how did you come to be where I was left?" Thomas was quiet for several paces before answering. "I have followed your caravan since yesterday. I watch all who pass through Cherokee land." "Were you planning to approach them?" "No. They were too many, too armed, too fearful." His voice held no accusation, merely observation. "But when the storm came, I saw them scatter, then regroup, then leave, but one was missing." Elizabeth absorbed this. "You counted." "Always." The single word carried the weight of hard-learned survival wisdom. They reached the mouth of a small cave cut into the hillside, protected from the elements by an overhang of rock. Thomas guided her to the entrance. "Wait here," he instructed, releasing her wrist. She heard him move ahead, the shuffle of what might have been dry grass or leaves, the strike of flint, and then the unmistakable crackling of kindling catching. Fire! The sudden warmth against her face was like a blessing. Elizabeth closed her eyes instinctively, though it made no difference to her perception, a habit from her sighted days that she had never broken. "Come," Thomas said. "Sit by the fire." He guided her to a spot where the heat was strongest, helping her settle on what felt like a mat of woven grasses. The fragrance of cedar and pine filled the small space. "Your clothes are wet. They must dry or you will sicken," Thomas said matter-of-factly. "I will turn away. There is a blanket of rabbit fur beside you." Elizabeth's hand found the soft pelt he described. Thank you," she managed, the propriety of her upbringing warring with practical necessity. She heard him move to the cave. Entrance felt the slight shift in the air as he turned his back to her. With cold, clumsy fingers, she began to unlace her sodden dress, pride giving way to the desperate need for warmth and survival. As she wrapped the fur around her shoulders, feeling its surprising softness against her skin, Elizabeth realized she had passed into a world where the rules and judgments of her former life no longer applied. Here, in this cave, with this stranger who had saved her without obligation, she existed in a space between her past and whatever uncertain future awaited her. And somehow, despite everything, she found herself drawing her first free breath in years. Morning arrived with subtle shifts, the chirping of birds replacing night insects, the cave warming as sunlight reached its entrance. Elizabeth woke disoriented, her hands instinctively seeking familiar surroundings and finding only the strange texture of rabbit fur and stone floor. Memory flooded back, the storm, the abandonment, the Cherokee scout. She sat up quickly, clutching, the fur around her shoulders. "Your clothes are dry," Thomas's voice came from the cave entrance, respectfully distant. "I have placed them beside you. There is water in a wooden cup to your right." Elizabeth's fingers found the rough-hewn cup, bringing it gratefully to her lips. The water was cool and fresh, washing away the sour taste of sleep and fear. "Thank you," she said, setting down the empty cup. Could you step outside?" "While I dress." "I am already outside," came the reply, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Call when you are ready." Left alone, Elizabeth felt for her clothes, finding them neatly folded beside her sleeping place. The fabric was still slightly damp in the deepest folds, but worlds better than the soaking garments she had removed the night before. Her fingers traced a tear in the sleeve she hadn't noticed previously, likely caught on a branch during their hasty journey through the forest. As she dressed, her mind churned with uncertainties. What would happen now? The caravan was gone, continuing westward without her. Even if Thomas helped her reach Cumberland settlement, what awaited her there? No family, no funds, no prospects, just the same pity and burden she had endured with the Pierces. "I am dressed," she called when she had finished, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly from more than just the morning chill. Thomas's footsteps entered the cave, accompanied by a new scent, something earthy and rich. "Food," he explained, sensing her alertness. "Cattail roots and smoked venison." He placed something in her hands, a flat piece of bark that served as a plate. Elizabeth felt its contents carefully. Strips of dried meat and what felt like small cooked tubers. "The roots grow in the marshland nearby," Thomas explained. "Good food when bread is not available." Elizabeth bit into one tentatively. It had a mild potato-like flavor, slightly sweet and unexpectedly pleasant. The venison was tough but smoky and satisfying. She realized suddenly how famished she was, having eaten nothing since the previous morning. "You hunt alone?" she asked between. bites, trying to piece together an understanding of this man who had saved her life, when necessary. His answer was typically economical. She heard him moving about the small cave, gathering things, preparations of some kind underway. "What will you do with me?" Elizabeth finally asked the question that had hovered in her mind since waking. Thomas paused in his activities. "That depends on what you wish, Elizabeth Morgan." The use of her full name startled her. She had almost forgotten she had told him. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, the stark truth of it settling heavily between them. "The settlement is at least 2 days' travel, if it even exists as promised. I have no money, no family waiting." "Then why did you join the Caravan west?" Thomas asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the bark plate. "I had no choice. After my parents died, my cousin's husband took their land. When he decided to go west, I went with them or face the poorhouse." The admission tasted bitter on her tongue. A blind woman has few options in this world. Silence followed her words. Then Thomas spoke, his voice closer than before. "The Cherokee do not cast aside those who cannot see with their eyes. Such people often see more clearly with their spirits." He took the empty bark plate from her hands. "You have choices now that you did not have yesterday. You can try to reach the settlement alone. I will point the way if that is your wish. I can guide you there myself, which would take 2 days of travel. Or, Elizabeth prompted when he didn't continue, or you can remain here for a time, learn to survive in this place. Then decide your path when you are stronger." The offer stunned her. "Why would you do that? Why help me at all?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "When I was a boy, my grandmother went blind in her final years. She was not abandoned. She was honored. Her wisdom sought even more than before. What your people did—" He stopped abruptly. "It is not our way." The simplicity of his explanation humbled her. No grand declarations of chivalry or Christian charity, just a fundamental difference in how his people viewed worth and obligation. "I would stay," Elizabeth said, before she could reconsider, "at least until I can be less of a burden." "Then we begin today," Thomas replied, and she could hear the nod in his voice. First lesson, the cave and the land around it. What followed was unlike anything Elizabeth had experienced since losing her sight. Instead of being protected from knowledge of her surroundings, guided everywhere with minimal explanation, seated and left in corners, treated as fragile and incapable, Thomas methodically helped her map the world immediately available to her. He led her through the cave, allowing her to touch the walls, teaching her to count steps between important features. 4 steps from sleeping mat to fire circle, 7 steps from fire to cave entrance, 3 steps right of entrance to water storage. Outside, he oriented her to the sun's warmth on her face. When you feel morning sun directly, you face east. Cave opening faces southeast. Stream lies west and downhill. He placed a sturdy walking stick in her hands, showing her how to use it to detect obstacles before her feet found them. Sweep in a small arc before each step. Listen to the sound it makes against different surfaces. Throughout the morning, Elizabeth concentrated intently, committing each detail to memory, determined to prove herself capable. By midday, she could navigate from her sleeping place to the cave entrance without assistance. It was a small victory, but one that filled her with quiet pride. "You learn quickly," Thomas observed, as they shared a midday meal of nuts and berries he had gathered. "I've had 3 years to practice remembering what I cannot see," Elizabeth replied. "Though no one before has taken the time to teach me properly. The ones who left you, they treated you as if your ears and mind were as blind as your eyes," Thomas said, cutting to the heart of how the Pierces had handled her disability. Elizabeth couldn't deny it. "They meant well, I suppose. At least, at first, but I became a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped." "That is their failing, not yours," Thomas said simply. The afternoon brought new lessons. Thomas taught her to identify different trees by their bark texture and scent, how to tell which direction water flowed by its sound, how to recognize when animals were nearby by their movements through underbrush. "Tonight, we will make better sleeping mats," he explained as they returned to the cave. "I will show you how to weave the grasses." As the sun began to set, a change Elizabeth perceived through the cooling air and subtle shift in forest sounds. Thomas built up the fire. The pleasant crackling and increased warmth signaled dinner preparations. "Your hands," Thomas said unexpectedly. "Show them to me." Puzzled, Elizabeth held them out. His fingers gently examined hers, turning them palm up. "Soft," he observed. "Not used to work." Heat crept into her cheeks. "I wasn't permitted to do much. Rebecca feared I would break things or hurt myself." "These hands must become stronger," he said matter-of-factly. "Tomorrow we begin with small tasks: weaving, fire building, food preparation." "You believe I can do these things?" Elizabeth couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice, years of enforced helplessness having taken their toll on her confidence. "I know you can," Thomas replied with quiet certainty. "Blindness is not weakness, Elizabeth Morgan. It is simply a different way of moving through the world." That night, as she lay on her sleeping mat, listening to the gentle pop and hiss of the dying fire, Elizabeth turned his words over in her mind. Different, not lesser, capable, not helpless. The possibility unfurled within her like a tightly closed flower sensing its first spring sunlight. For the first time since losing her sight, someone looked at her and saw potential instead of burden. The revelation was both terrifying and exhilarating. Sleep came slowly, her mind too active with plans and possibilities for the days ahead. Just before consciousness slipped away, a sudden realization jolted through her. She had not once today wished to be found by the Pierces or the Caravan. Whatever uncertain future lay before her, Elizabeth Morgan had already taken her first step toward freedom, not despite her blindness, but with it as simply another facet of who she was. Days melted into one another as Elizabeth settled into a routine that would have been unimaginable in her previous life. Each morning began with Thomas's quiet voice rousing her from sleep, followed by simple but nourishing meals and tasks designed to strengthen both her body and her confidence. On the fifth day, rain returned, gentler than the storm that had stranded, but persistent enough to keep them largely confined to the cave. The constant patter against the stone overhang created a soothing rhythm that Elizabeth found herself unconsciously matching as she worked on weaving a small basket from river reeds Thomas had collected the previous day. "Your fingers are learning the patterns," Thomas observed as he sat nearby, fashioning new arrowheads from stone with methodical precision. The soft scraping sound provided a counterpoint to her weaving. Elizabeth paused, running her fingers over her work. The basket was crude compared to what Thomas could produce, but the reeds bent to her will more readily than they had when she first attempted the skill. "I've never created anything useful before," she admitted. "In my father's house, I played piano and embroidered decorative things. After losing my sight, I wasn't trusted to do even that much." Thomas made a non-committal sound, neither judgment nor pity. "Different skills for different worlds. Here, what you make keeps you alive." A sudden gust of wind drove rain into the cave entrance, bringing with it the rich, loamy scent of wet earth. Elizabeth lifted her face toward the cooler air, inhaling deeply. "The rain smells different here than in Virginia," she observed. "Wilder somehow." "You are learning to read the world through senses beyond sight," Thomas said, approval warming his typically measured tone. "What else do you notice?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, a habit from her sighted days that helped her concentrate. "The birds are quiet now, but they'll sing when the rain stops. The stream runs faster today. I can hear the difference in its voice. And—" She hesitated, uncertain of this last observation. "Speak," Thomas encouraged. There's tension in the air, a heaviness that wasn't there yesterday. Thomas set down his work, the stone scraper falling silent. Good. You sense the changing pressure. Storm's not finished. Bigger weather comes. Elizabeth's hands stilled on her basket. Like the one that separated me from the caravan? Perhaps. Nature speaks warnings to those who listen. Thomas moved. Toward the cave entrance, she could hear him arranging something. Additional protection against the coming weather, she guessed. Will we be safe here? She asked, a flutter of anxiety stirring in her chest. Cave has stood through many seasons, Thomas replied, but we prepare. First rule of survival, respect what you cannot control. Throughout the afternoon, they worked to secure their shelter. Thomas guided Elizabeth's hands as they piled stones to divert water from the entrance, arranged their supplies higher against the cave walls, and gathered additional firewood while it was still relatively dry. As evening approached, the wind intensified, howling through the trees with increasing ferocity. The temperature dropped sharply, and Thomas built the fire higher than usual. Cold comes with this storm, he explained as he placed a warm cup of pine needle tea in Elizabeth's hands. Drink. It will help keep sickness away. The tea was bitter, but not unpleasant, with a resinous fragrance that reminded her of Christmas. As she sipped, Elizabeth realized how much her perception of comfort had changed in less than a week. The hard stone floor covered with woven mats, the simple fare, the close quarters with a man who had been a stranger days ago, all would have horrified her former self. Now they represent safety and survival. You're quiet, Thomas observed after a time. Elizabeth cradled the warm cup between her palms. I was thinking about how quickly we adapt when we must. A week ago, I slept in a wagon and ate from tin plates. I worried about propriety and appearances. She gave a small, rueful laugh. Now I'm grateful for pine needle tea and a dry place to sleep. Humans carry too many unnecessary concerns, Thomas said. Nature strips them away, leaves what matters. His philosophy was so different from the complex social rules that had governed Elizabeth's life. Simpler, more direct, yet containing profound truth. The storm intensified as night fell fully. Rain lashed at the cave entrance, and wind shrieked through the forest beyond. Occasional crashes indicated falling branches or trees succumbing to the gale. Thomas added more wood to the fire. Sleep may be difficult tonight, he warned. Storm speaks loudly. Elizabeth wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders, unable to suppress a shiver that wasn't entirely from cold. It sounds angry. Nature is not angry or kind, Thomas replied. It simply is. Human minds seek meaning in what has no meaning. A particularly violent gust sent embers swirling from the fire, accompanied by the distant crack of splitting wood. Thomas moved quickly to stamp out any stray sparks. That was close, Elizabeth said, her heart beating faster. Yes, we should... Thomas stopped abruptly, his sudden silence more alarming than any words. What is it? Elizabeth asked, tension coiling in her stomach. Listen, he instructed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Elizabeth strained her ears past the storm's chaos. At first, she heard nothing unusual. Then, a low, rumbling growl emanated from near the cave entrance. The sound raised the hair on her arms. Mountain lion, Thomas breathed so quietly she almost didn't hear him, seeking shelter from the storm. Fear clutched at Elizabeth's throat, nearly choking her. What do we do? She whispered back. Be still. Fire will keep it at the entrance. Most times they avoid humans. Most times. The qualifier hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Elizabeth heard Thomas moving with deliberate slowness. The soft scrape of metal suggested he was retrieving his knife, or perhaps the small axe he used for chopping wood. The growl came again, louder this time. Elizabeth could picture the creature. Tawny fur, powerful shoulders, eyes gleaming in the firelight. She had seen one once, years ago, mounted in a wealthy neighbor's study. Even in death, it had radiated lethal grace. "If it comes closer," Thomas murmured, "move behind me, slowly." Elizabeth nodded, belatedly realizing he might not see the gesture in the dimness. "Yes," she whispered. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The mountain lion paced at the cave entrance, occasionally growling or making strange, plaintive cries that sounded eerily human. The storm continued unabated, likely driving the predator to seek any available shelter. Thomas remained, vigilant, periodically adding wood to the fire to maintain a bright barrier between them and the big cat. Elizabeth sat perfectly still, hands clenched in her lap, every sense heightened by fear. "It's moving closer," she whispered suddenly, certain despite her blindness. She could feel the animal's presence, a shift in the air, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. "Now," Thomas said quietly. "Behind me." Elizabeth slid backward, careful not to make sudden movements. Her hand found Thomas's shoulder as he positioned himself between her and the threat. She could feel the tense readiness in his muscles. A snarl ripped through the cave, followed by the distinct sound of padded paws on stone. The mountain lion had entered their shelter. Thomas spoke suddenly, not in English but in Cherokee, his voice low but commanding. The words meant nothing to Elizabeth, but the tone conveyed clear warning. The big cat growled in response. Elizabeth could smell it now, a musky, wild scent overlaid with the sharper smell of wet fur. Thomas shifted slightly, and she heard the rasp of metal, his hunting knife being drawn. He spoke again, the strange syllables rolling from his tongue with quiet authority. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The mountain lion roared, a sound so primal and powerful that Elizabeth felt it in her bones. Thomas surged forward with explosive energy. There was a confusion of sounds, snarling, the scuffle of movement, a pained grunt from Thomas that sent Elizabeth's heart into her throat. Then a final terrible yowl from the mountain lion, followed by the heavy thud of a large body hitting the cave floor. Silence descended, broken only by Thomas's labored breathing and the continuing rage of the storm outside. "Thomas," Elizabeth called anxiously. "Are you hurt?" "Scratched," he replied, his voice strained. "Not serious." She heard him moving, dragging something heavy. "The cat?" "Dead," he confirmed. "It will provide food and fur when a storm passes." Elizabeth released a shuddering breath. "You saved my life. Again." "We saved each other," Thomas corrected. "Your warning gave me time to prepare." He returned to her side, and she reached out. Instinctively, her fingers finding his arm. Warm wetness met her touch. "You're bleeding," she said with alarm. "Small wounds," Thomas insisted, though his voice betrayed pain he wouldn't otherwise acknowledge. "Need cleaning." Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "Tell me what to do." For once, Thomas didn't object to her help. "Water in the small pot by the fire. Clean cloth in my bundle." With careful movements, Elizabeth located the items. "Guide my hands," she requested. Thomas directed her as she cleaned his wounds, 3 deep scratches across his forearm where the mountain lion's claws had found their mark. The injuries weren't life-threatening, but they clearly caused significant pain. "Plants in a leather pouch," Thomas instructed. "Crushed yarrow leaves. Apply to cuts." Elizabeth followed his instructions, her touch gentle but sure. As she dressed, his wounds, a profound role reversal, settled over her. For the first time, Thomas needed her help, not the other way around. "You did well," Thomas said when she had finished bandaging his arm. "Steady hands." "I've had practice," Elizabeth replied, allowing a small smile. 3 years of learning to do everything by touch. As they settled back beside the fire, the storm still raging outside, but the more immediate danger past, Elizabeth felt a curious sense of accomplishment mingled with lingering fear. "Will there be more?" she asked. Mountain lions? Not likely, Thomas assured her. They hunt alone, claim large territories. He paused. But wilderness holds many dangers, some with claws, some with guns. His words reminded Elizabeth that they existed in a precarious space, not just between civilization and wilderness, but between two colliding worlds with long histories of violence and mistrust. "Is that why you live alone?" she asked, the question escaping before she could consider its propriety. Thomas was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of painful memory. "I have walked too long between worlds to belong fully to either." In that simple statement, Elizabeth heard echoes of her own isolation, different in cause but perhaps similar. In effect, both of them existed on the margins, navigating boundaries others took for granted. The storm outside began to abate, the wind's howl softening to a moan. The immediate dangers had passed, but as Elizabeth drifted toward exhausted sleep, Thomas's words lingered in her mind. The wilderness had teeth and claws, yes, but so did the world of men. And she was no longer certain which presented the greater threat. The morning after the mountain lion attack dawned clear and cold. Elizabeth woke to the unfamiliar weight of a new fur across her sleeping mat, the pelt of the great cat, carefully cleaned and prepared while she slept. "You were busy last night," she observed, running her fingers through the surprisingly soft fur. "Waste nothing," Thomas replied simply. "The cat gives us warmth, meat, and tools. Its spirit deserves respect." Over breakfast, roasted mountain, lion meat that tasted gamey but satisfying, Thomas announced their plans for the day. "Today we leave the cave," he said. "You must learn the surrounding land." Elizabeth felt a flutter of anxiety. "Is your arm well enough?" The scratches had been deep, the bandaging extensive. "It will heal," Thomas replied, dismissing his injury with characteristic stoicism. "Knowledge of the land cannot wait. Storm has passed, but winter approaches." The implications were clear. Her survival depended on expanding her understanding beyond their immediate shelter. Outside, the air held the crisp clarity that follows major storms. Elizabeth inhaled deeply, detecting subtle changes in the forest. Fresher, scents where rain had washed away dust, the sharp tang of broken pine branches, the earthy perfume of mushrooms suddenly sprouting in dampened soil. "Take your walking stick," Thomas instructed. "Today we made a map you can carry here." He tapped her forehead gently. What followed was unlike any lesson Elizabeth had experienced. Thomas guided her in expanding circles outward from the cave, teaching her to identify landmarks through touch, sound, and scent. He showed her how sloping ground always indicated direction, how the sun's warmth on her face oriented her, how streams and animal paths created navigation lines through the wilderness. "The forest speaks constantly," he explained as they paused, beside a fallen oak. "Wind through pine needles sounds different than through oak leaves. Morning birds sing in different locations than evening birds. Deer paths run east-west. Creek flows to the river southward." Elizabeth absorbed these lessons eagerly, constructing a mental map far more complex than she would have believed possible days earlier. When Thomas unexpectedly stepped away, telling her to find her own path back to the cave, anxiety surged briefly before determination took its place. She stood still, orienting herself. The sun's warmth fell on her right cheek. West, then. The ground sloped subtly downward toward the stream. North. That meant the cave lay southeast. Elizabeth tapped her walking stick against the ground, finding the barely perceptible deer. Trail Thomas had shown her earlier. She followed it confidently, counting steps under her breath. At a distinctive rock formation, a jutting stone shelf she had learned to recognize by touch, she turned eastward, following the sound of wind, through a stand of young pines. 23 steps later, her stick detected the slight depression that marked the final approach to the cave. "I've returned," she called, unable to keep pride from her voice. Thomas's answering footsteps emerged from inside the cave. "You found the way without hesitation," he observed. "Faster than yesterday." "Yesterday?" Elizabeth questioned, momentarily confused. A rare chuckle escaped Thomas. "You thought that was the first time I left you to find your own path? I have watched over you each day, stepping aside to let you navigate alone. Today is simply the first time I told you of it." Elizabeth wasn't sure whether to feel indignant or grateful. "You've been testing me." "Teaching you," Thomas corrected. "Confidence comes from doing, not from being told you can do." His words struck her deeply. How different from the anxious hovering of the Pierces, their constant reminders of her limitations, their insistence on protecting her from even the possibility of self-sufficiency. "Thank you," she said finally, "for believing I could before I knew it myself." The afternoon brought new challenges. Thomas taught her to identify edible plants by smell and texture, the distinctive serrated edges of raspberry leaves, the smooth coolness of wild onion bulbs, the fuzzy stems of mints. "Winter comes soon," he reminded her. "Plants sleep. We must harvest what remains and store knowledge for spring's return." As they worked, Elizabeth sensed a subtle shift in Thomas's demeanor, a new urgency underlying his calm instruction. She paused in gathering the last of the wild blackberries, her fingers stained with purple juice. "You're worried about something," she observed. It wasn't a question. Thomas fell silent, his hesitation uncharacteristic. "Word will have reached Cherokee villages about the white woman in my care," he said finally. "Questions will come, perhaps trouble." Elizabeth's hands stilled on the berries. "Your people would not approve?" "Some would not. Others would understand." Thomas sighed, a rare display of emotion. Cherokee relations with settlers grow more strained each season. Land treaties broken, promises forgotten. Elizabeth felt a weight settle in her chest. Her presence complicated Thomas's already precarious position between two worlds. "I should leave," she said, the words painful but necessary. "Go to the settlement as planned." "Could you survive the journey?" Thomas asked, not unkindly. They both knew the answer. Despite her rapid progress, Elizabeth was nowhere near capable of navigating 2 days of difficult terrain alone. "I don't want to bring you trouble," she said softly. "Trouble finds all paths eventually," Thomas replied. "Better to face it prepared." They returned to the cave as evening approached, Elizabeth's basket heavy with foraged foods. Thomas had been quieter than usual during their walk back, his thoughts clearly occupied by concerns he hadn't fully shared. As they prepared their evening meal, Elizabeth found herself hyper-aware of his movements. The careful precision as he sliced dried meat, the gentle tap of his knife against stone as he worked. She realized with sudden clarity how much his presence had come to mean to her. More than safety or survival knowledge, Thomas offered something she had missed since losing her sight: respect for her capacity to adapt and learn. "I've been thinking," Thomas said unexpectedly as they sat beside the fire. "Tomorrow we begin new lessons." "What kind of lessons?" Elizabeth asked, curiosity piqued. "How to listen to what cannot be heard," he replied. "The Cherokee believe those without sight often see more clearly with the spirit. My grandmother had this gift in her blindness." Elizabeth remained silent, unsure how to respond. In her Virginia upbringing, talk of spirits and unseen worlds belonged to Sunday sermons, not practical daily life. "You doubt," Thomas observed, no judgment in his voice. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Elizabeth admitted. "Everything I was taught seems distant now, like stories told to a child." Thomas added wood to the fire, the crackle of new flames filling the silence between them. "When eyes close, other paths open, but only for those willing to walk them." "What does that mean?" Elizabeth asked. "It means you must decide if you trust only what others have told you, or if you will discover truths for yourself." The simplicity of his statement contained depths she couldn't yet fathom. That night, as Elizabeth lay on her sleeping mat, the mountain lion's pelt providing unexpected comfort, she contemplated Thomas's words. Her world had contracted dramatically when blindness took her sight. Boundaries imposed by others' perceptions of her capabilities, her own fears, the physical limitations of navigating without vision. Yet here, paradoxically, in this remote wilderness with a man whose background couldn't be more different from her own, her world expanded daily. New skills, new awareness, new possibilities unfolded with each lesson. What other discoveries awaited if she opened herself to ways of understanding, beyond those she had been taught? As sleep claimed her, Elizabeth realized that despite the uncertainties ahead, despite the dangers Thomas had hinted at, she felt more truly alive than she had since before the fever took her sight. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. But for the first time since darkness fell over her world, Elizabeth faced the future with curiosity rather than dread. The lessons Thomas had promised began at dawn. Elizabeth woke to the soft sound of chanting, a low, rhythmic murmur in Cherokee that seemed to vibrate through the cave's cool air. She sat up, orienting herself to the unfamiliar cadence. "Thomas!" The chanting stopped. "You are awake earlier than usual," he observed. "Your singing woke me," she replied, wrapping the mountain lion pelt around her shoulders against the morning. "Chill." "What were you doing?" "Morning prayer," he explained, "greeting the sun, honoring ancestors, asking for clear thoughts." There was a pause, then, "It is not singing." Elizabeth detected the faintest hint of amusement in his correction. "Will you teach me the words?" Her question seemed to surprise him. After a moment's hesitation, he said, "Perhaps. First, other lessons." Breakfast was simple: dried berries softened in hot water and the last of the mountain lion meat. As they ate, Thomas outlined the day ahead. "Today, you learn to listen beyond hearing," he said, "to feel what cannot be touched." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow skeptically. "That sounds impossible," Thomas finished for her. "Many things seem impossible until they are done." He led her outside, the morning air still crisp with late autumn's sharp edge. Instead of heading toward the forest as usual, Thomas guided her to a flat, sun-warmed rock overlooking the valley below. "Sit," he instructed. "Cross your legs if you are comfortable." Elizabeth arranged herself on the smooth stone surface, feeling the sun's early rays on her face. Thomas settled beside her, close enough that she could sense his presence, but not touching. "Close your eyes," he said, then added with rare mirth, "Though for you, perhaps this is not necessary." Elizabeth smiled at the gentle jest. "They're closed. Now what?" Breathe deeply. Feel air enter your body. Leave your body. Nothing else matters. Now, not the past, not the future, only this breath. Elizabeth complied, focusing on the simple rhythm of her breathing. The practice wasn't entirely foreign to her. As a child, her grandmother had taught her similar techniques for calming piano performance nerves. "Now," Thomas continued, his voice softening, "listen to the world, not with intention, not searching for specific sounds. Let all sounds enter together." The instruction seemed paradoxical, but Elizabeth tried. Rather than identifying individual noises as she normally would, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant gurgle of the stream, she attempted to receive them all simultaneously, without labeling or prioritizing. Gradually, something shifted in her perception. The sounds began to form a unified tapestry, rather than competing for her attention. The forest's voice became singular, despite its countless components. "The land speaks," Thomas said quietly. "Not in words, but in patterns, rhythms. When something disrupts these patterns, those who listen will know. They sat in silence for what might have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to stretch and contract unpredictably as Elizabeth surrendered to the experience. The sun climbed higher, warming her face and hands. Then, abruptly, Thomas stiffened beside her. "Someone comes." Elizabeth hadn't heard anything unusual, yet Thomas was already on his feet. "How do you—" "The birds near the eastern ridge fell silent," he explained tersely, then resumed in a pattern of alarm, not greeting. Now that he mentioned it, Elizabeth detected the change, a subtle shift in the cadence of bird calls that she would never have noticed without his guidance. "Who is it?" she asked, rising to her feet, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. "Not settlers," Thomas replied, some tension leaving his voice. "Cherokee, 3, perhaps 4. He touched her elbow lightly. "Come, we will meet them at the cave." They returned to their shelter, Thomas gathering items as they waited. His hunting knife, a small pouch Elizabeth knew contained sacred herbs, a carved wooden pipe she had never seen him use. "Are these friends, or—" She let the question trail off. "We will know soon," Thomas replied. "Stay near the fire circle. Speak only when addressed directly." The instructions heightened Elizabeth's anxiety, but she nodded agreement, taking her position as directed. Minutes later, the subtle sound of approaching footsteps confirmed Thomas's prediction. Words were exchanged in Cherokee, Thomas's voice measured and respectful, the newcomer's tones questioning, perhaps challenging. Elizabeth remained still, her hands folded in her lap, acutely aware of being assessed by eyes she couldn't see. Finally, Thomas switched to English. "Elizabeth, these are people from my village, a yoka, a medicine woman, her son Sequoia, and Chii, who leads our hunters." "Greetings," Elizabeth said, inclining her head toward where the voices had come from. "Thank you for the hospitality of your land." A woman's voice responded, older, authoritative, with an accent thicker than Thomas's. "You are the blind one he shelters. Word has traveled to the village." "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed simply. "Thomas saved my life when my people abandoned me." A male voice, younger, harder-edged, spoke next. "Waiaunole has always collected strange things. A blind white woman may be his strangest yet." "Sequoia," the woman, Ayoka, admonished sharply. "Forgive my son," she continued in English. "He forgets his manners when his caution speaks too loudly." "There is nothing to forgive," Elizabeth replied carefully. "Caution is wise in uncertain times." Her response seemed to surprise them. A brief conversation in Cherokee followed too. Rapid for Elizabeth to detect any meaning from the tones, Thomas spoke again. "They have come with news, and to see for themselves who shelters with me." "Is the news good or ill?" Elizabeth asked. Another silence, heavy with unspoken communications. "Both," Ayoka answered finally. "White soldiers have come to the trading post at Cumberland Ford. They speak of new boundaries, new treaties, and they search for missing settlers." Elizabeth's heart skipped. "My caravan." "Perhaps," the older woman confirmed. "They offer payment for information about a blind woman lost in the storm." The revelation landed like a physical blow. The Pierces were looking for her, or at least creating the appearance of doing so. But why? They had deliberately left her behind. "The soldiers bring trouble for the Cherokee," the man called Tsii stated flatly. "Your presence here could bring more." Thomas responded in Cherokee, his tone firm but respectful. The conversation continued in their language, occasionally rising in intensity before settling again. Elizabeth remained silent, understanding that her fate was being discussed, but unable to influence the outcome. Finally, Thomas addressed her in English. "The council must decide what is best for the tribe. Ayoka suggests you come to the village until this is resolved." Fear and uncertainty flooded Elizabeth's mind. The village would mean strangers, unfamiliar surroundings, potential hostility. Yet refusing could place Thomas in an impossible position between his people and his choice to help her. "Would I be welcome there?" she asked directly. "You would be safe," Ayoka replied, sidestepping the question of welcome. "And we could determine what these soldiers truly seek." Elizabeth squared her shoulders. "When must we leave?" "Tomorrow at dawn," Thomas answered. "Tonight they will share our fire and food." What followed was one of the strangest evenings of Elizabeth's life. As Thomas and their visitors prepared a meal, conversation flowed around her, sometimes in English, often in Cherokee. She listened intently, gathering impressions of each visitor through their voices, movements, and interactions. Ayoka carried authority wrapped in wisdom, her questions direct, but never unkind. T spoke little, but moved with precision that Elizabeth could sense even without sight. Sequoia remained suspicious, his occasional English comments clipped and guarded. As they ate roasted rabbit and foraged roots, Ayoka unexpectedly addressed Elizabeth directly. "Thomas says you learn quickly the ways of forest survival." "I have an excellent teacher," Elizabeth replied, "and perhaps more reason than most to listen carefully to his lessons." "Tell me," the older woman continued, "what did you dream about last night?" The question seemed odd, disconnected from their previous conversation. Elizabeth hesitated. "Dreams speak truths the waking mind cannot hear," Ayoka explained, "especially for those whose eyes see darkness." Elizabeth considered carefully before answering. "I dreamed of water, a river wider than any I've known, with 2 paths leading from its banks. I stood between them, unable to choose which to follow." A loaded silence followed her words. Then Ayoka made a soft sound of interest. "The river of decision," she said. "You stand at its edge now, blind one. Soon you must choose your path." As night deepened around them and their visitors settled into sleep near the fire, Elizabeth pondered the medicine woman's words. What choice awaited her, between returning to the settlers or remaining with the Cherokee? Between her past life and whatever uncertain future might unfold here, tomorrow would bring a journey to the village and perhaps answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. Dawn arrived with a thin veil of mist clinging to the forest floor. Elizabeth woke to the sounds of quiet preparation, the soft murmur of voices speaking Cherokee, the rustle of belongings being gathered, the distinctive scrape of Thomas's knife against stone as he sharpened it one final time. "We leave soon," he told her, placing a small bundle beside her sleeping mat. "These are for you, moccasins, better for the journey than your boots." Elizabeth ran her fingers over the supple deerskin, feeling the careful stitching and delicate beadwork along the edges. "They're beautiful," she said, genuinely touched by the unexpected gift. "Did you make these?" "Ayoka," Thomas replied. "She worked through the night. She says your feet have learned enough of the land to deserve proper covering." The medicine woman's gesture moved Elizabeth deeply. Despite whatever misgivings the Cherokee might harbor about her presence, this small kindness offered a glimmer of potential acceptance. Breakfast was hurried, dried meat and a warm tea that tasted of mint and something earthier Elizabeth couldn't identify. As they prepared to depart, Thomas guided her through a final inspection of the cave. "We may not return," he explained, helping her gather the few possessions she had accumulated. "Take what you can carry easily." The realization that she might never come back to this place struck Elizabeth with surprising force. The cave had become her first true sanctuary since losing her sight, a place where she'd begun to reclaim her independence, to redefine her capabilities beyond the limiting expectations of others. "I'm ready," she said finally, slinging a small leather pouch containing her mother's Bible, the mountain lion pelt Thomas had given her, and a few other essential items across her body. The journey began with little ceremony. Elizabeth walked between Thomas and Ayoka, with Tsi leading and Sequoia following behind. The pace was steady, but not hurried, accommodating her need to navigate carefully with her walking stick. "How far is the village?" Elizabeth asked, as they descended the familiar path toward the stream. "Half-day's walk for those with sight," Ayoka answered. "Perhaps longer at our pace." There was no criticism in the observation, merely practicality. Elizabeth appreciated the honesty. "I'll try not to slow you unnecessarily," she promised. "Time moves as it should," the older woman replied cryptically. "Some journeys cannot be rushed." As they crossed the stream, Thomas guiding Elizabeth across stepping stones with patient hands, Sequoia spoke for the first time that morning. "The soldiers will have scouts watching the main trails," he warned. "We should take the ridge path." A brief discussion in Cherokee followed. With Thomas seemingly disagreeing, Elizabeth caught the repeated word galunlati, unfamiliar but spoken with emphasis. "The ridge path is steeper, more difficult," Thomas explained to Elizabeth when they switched back to English, "but perhaps safer from unwanted eyes." "I can manage steeper terrain," Elizabeth assured them, determined not to be the weak link in their group. "I've been practicing on the slopes near the cave." Tsi made a sound that might have been approved. "The blind woman has courage. Let us hope she also has endurance." The path indeed proved challenging, a narrow track that wound upward through increasingly rocky terrain. Elizabeth's world narrowed to the careful placement of each foot, the constant vigilance required to detect changes in the ground beneath her walking stick, the steady rhythm of her breathing as they climbed higher. Thomas remained close, occasionally murmuring quiet warnings or guidance, but largely allowing her to navigate independently. Elizabeth sensed this was as much for the benefit of the other Cherokee as for her own pride, a demonstration that she wasn't entirely helpless. By midday, the exertion had taken its toll. When they paused to rest in a small clearing, Elizabeth sank gratefully onto a fallen log, her legs trembling with fatigue. The new moccasins had proven remarkably comfortable, but even they couldn't entirely mitigate the difficulty of the journey. "Drink," Thomas instructed, pressing a water skin into her hands. Slowly, as Elizabeth sipped the cool water, she became aware of a subtle tension in the group. The others had gathered a short distance away, their voices low but intense as they conversed. In Cherokee. "What's wrong?" she asked Thomas when he returned to her side. He hesitated before answering. "Sequoia believes we are being followed." Alarm shot through Elizabeth. "The soldiers?" "No." Thomas's voice dropped further. "Something else. Tracks, not made by white men's boots or Cherokee moccasins. What then? He is not certain, but he is rarely mistaken about such things." Their rest was cut short, the group pressing onward with new urgency. The path began to descend, winding through stands of pine that filled the air with resinous fragrance. Despite the cooler temperatures at the higher elevation, Elizabeth found herself sweating from exertion and anxiety. As the afternoon wore on, she became increasingly aware of sounds around them, not just the natural forest noises she had learned to interpret, but something more deliberate. Occasionally a branch would snap at a distance, or stones would clatter down a slope behind them. "I hear it too," she whispered to Thomas after one such occurrence. "Something is following us." Thomas squeezed her arm briefly in acknowledgement. "Stay close." The pace quickened, the group moving with greater purpose. Elizabeth struggled to keep up, her blindness more limiting at this accelerated speed. Twice she stumbled on hidden roots or stones, saved from falling only by Thomas's quick reflexes. Suddenly, Tsi hissed a warning. The group froze. Elizabeth held her breath, straining to hear what had alarmed their guide. A low growl emerged. From the underbrush ahead, not the mountain lion's rumble, but something equally primal and threatening. Then another answered from behind them. "Wolves," Ahyoka whispered. "A pack." Fear tightened around Elizabeth's chest. One predator had been terrifying enough. A pack spelled certain death if they attacked. "Circle," Thomas ordered quietly. "Elizabeth." In the center, the group rearranged swiftly, forming a protective ring around her. Elizabeth clutched her walking stick, knowing it would provide little defense, but unwilling to stand entirely helpless. "They do not usually hunt humans," Tsi observed, his voice betraying confusion. "Something drives them to desperation." "Or someone," Sequoia added grimly. Another growl, closer now. Elizabeth could hear the soft padding of paws circling their position, the occasional snap of jaws. Thomas spoke quietly in Cherokee, a prayer or perhaps a chant, the words flowing with rhythmic intensity. To Elizabeth's surprise, Ahyoka joined him, their voices twining together in ancient syllables that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The wolves' movements changed, still circling but more hesitant, less coordinated. A high-pitched whine rose from one, answered by confused growls from the others. "They are uncertain now," Ahyoka murmured to Elizabeth. "The old words remind them of the time when wolf and human spoke the same language." Elizabeth wasn't sure whether to believe such. Things were possible, but the effect was undeniable. The wolves' aggressive stance was wavering. Tsi seized the moment, striking flint to steel and creating a sudden shower of sparks that ignited a handful of dried pine needles he had prepared. The small flame cast dancing shadows through the trees. "Fire!" he announced, feeding the flame until it grew stronger. "Now we make our stand." The wolves retreated further from the firelight, their growls diminishing. Elizabeth felt the tension in their circle ease slightly, though no one relaxed. "Their vigilance. We cannot stay here," Sequoia pointed out. "Night comes and the village is still far." "We make torches," Thomas decided. "Continue with fire." Working quickly, the group fashioned crude torches from pine branches, wrapping them with resin-soaked bark that caught the flames eagerly. Elizabeth was given a smaller branch, its end glowing hot, not to carry but to hold ready if needed. They set off again, movement slower but steadier, the wolves keeping pace at a distance but no longer closing in. Elizabeth could hear them tracking parallel to their path, occasionally growling or whining to each other. "They are being driven," Ahyoka said quietly, walking close beside Elizabeth now. "Something compels them against their nature." "What could make wolves behave this way?" Elizabeth asked, clutching her firebrand tightly. The old woman was silent for several steps before answering. "There are those among both your people and mine who know the old ways of controlling animals. Dark medicine." The implication chilled Elizabeth more than the approaching evening air. "Someone is deliberately targeting us?" "Perhaps," Ahyoka allowed. "Or perhaps it is, as Tsi says, hunger drives them to unusual behavior." But her tone suggested she believed the former explanation, not the latter. As darkness began to fall in earnest, their torches became their primary defense and guidance. Elizabeth walked carefully, hyper-aware of every sound around them, the wolves' presence a constant reminder of hovering danger. "Listen!" Thomas said suddenly, his voice lifting with cautious hope. "Drums!" Elizabeth strained her ears and caught it, a faint but steady rhythm carried on the evening breeze. "The village welcomes the night," Ahyoka explained. "We are closer than I thought." The wolves seemed to hear it too. Their tracking sounds receded gradually until Sequoia confirmed they had departed altogether. Relief washed through the group, though no one lowered their guard completely. They pressed forward with renewed energy, the distant drums growing steadily louder, guiding them home. For Elizabeth, those drumbeats represented an unknown future, a Cherokee village where she would be an outsider, a curiosity, perhaps even a threat. Yet after facing wolves and wilderness, after being abandoned by her own people, The prospect of reaching human settlement, any settlement, filled her with determined hope. The real test of survival, she was beginning to understand, would not be in the forest, but in what awaited her beyond it. The drums grew louder as they approached the village, accompanied now by the sound of voices, the bark of dogs, and the subtle but unmistakable energy of a community preparing for evening. Elizabeth felt the path change beneath her feet, from forest floor to a more traveled trail, packed firm by countless footsteps. "Many will stare," Thomas warned her quietly. "Few have seen white woman who walks in darkness." "I'm accustomed to stares I cannot see," Elizabeth replied, straightening her shoulders. "Though I admit being curious among the Cherokee was not something I ever imagined." "Be respectful but not fearful," Ayoka advised from her other side. "Our people value strength in adversity." The sounds of the village suddenly enveloped them as they crossed some invisible boundary. The drumming paused briefly, then resumed at a different tempo. Voices hushed momentarily before erupting in questions, children calling out excitedly, adults speaking in rapid Cherokee that Elizabeth couldn't hope to follow. Thomas kept a steadying hand at her elbow as they moved deeper into the village. The rich tapestry of scents overwhelmed Elizabeth's senses. Wood smoke, cooking meat, unfamiliar herbs, tanned hides, and the distinctive smell of many humans living in close proximity. "The council house lies ahead," Thomas murmured. "The elders will wish to speak with us immediately." Elizabeth nodded, her throat too dry for words. The weight of dozens of unseen eyes pressed against her, judging, assessing, wondering. A new voice, elderly, male, carrying natural authority, spoke in Cherokee. Thomas answered respectfully, his hand tightening slightly on Elizabeth's arm. "Chief Adahi wishes to know why we bring a blind settler woman to our village during troubled times," Thomas translated, keeping his voice low. Before Elizabeth could respond, Ayoka stepped forward, speaking at length in Cherokee. Though Elizabeth couldn't understand the words, she recognized the medicine woman was advocating for her, the tone both respectful and insistent. "Come," Thomas said when Ayoka finished. "We go to the council now." They were led to a large circular structure. Elizabeth could tell by the way sounds echoed within it, and the distinctive smell of old smoke preserved in wooden beams. She was guided to sit on what felt like a woven mat, Thomas taking position beside her. What followed was unlike anything in Elizabeth's experience. The formal council unfolded primarily in Cherokee, with Thomas occasionally translating key points in whispered English. Chief Adahi spoke first, his deep voice resonating with measured dignity. Then Tesi recounted their journey, the wolf encounter drawing murmurs of concern from the gathered elders. When Sequoia mentioned the soldiers at Cumberland Ford searching for a blind woman, the council's atmosphere tensed noticeably. Finally, Thomas was called to speak. He explained how he had found Elizabeth abandoned during the storm, his decision to help her, and the skills she had shown in adapting to forest life. His tone remained factual, neither defending nor apologizing for his actions. A period of questions followed, some directed at Thomas, others at Ayoka or Tsi. Elizabeth sat quietly, understanding that to interrupt would be seen as disrespectful. Yet as the discussion continued, entirely in Cherokee now, her patience began to fray. "Thomas," she whispered finally, "they are deciding my fate. Should I not speak for myself?" A ripple of reaction told her the council had heard and understood her English words. Thomas hesitated, clearly caught between protocols. To Elizabeth's surprise, it was Chief Adahi who responded, speaking in clear if accented English. "The blind one wishes to speak. We will hear her words." Elizabeth turned her face toward his voice, gathering her thoughts carefully. "Honorable Chief and Council, I come before you not by choice but by circumstance. My own people abandoned me to die. Thomas Black Fox showed me kindness when my blood kin did not." She paused, then continued with growing confidence. I have learned much from him, how to hear the forest speak, how to find my way without eyes, how to value what truly matters. I understand my presence brings complications. If you wish me to leave, I will do so, though I ask for guidance to reach safe haven." She squared her shoulders. "But know this, I have no desire to return to those who left me to die, nor to bring soldiers to your doors. I seek only to find a place where I might live with dignity despite my blindness." A long silence followed her words. Then Chief Adahy spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "You speak with an honest heart, blind one. But these are dangerous times between our peoples. Treaties made are treaties broken. Cherokee land shrinks with each season. Your presence here may bring unwanted attention." "I understand," Elizabeth acknowledged. "What would you have me do?" Another voice joined the conversation, female, elderly, speaking first in Cherokee, then switching to English. "I am Grandmother Galilahi. I have lived 90 winters. I have seen white men come, seen promises made and broken." Her voice carried the weight of decades of observation. "This woman is not responsible for the crimes of her people," Grandmother Galilahi continued, "and she has been touched by the Great Spirit's hand. Those who walk in darkness often carry a special sight." The elders' support surprised Elizabeth. She bowed her head respectfully, uncertain how to respond. Chief Adahy seemed to consider the grandmother's words carefully. "She may remain for 7 days, he finally decided, "under Waya Unol's responsibility. Then we will decide her future." Thomas thanked the chief formally. The council continued briefly, addressing other tribal matters before adjourning. As the members dispersed, Elizabeth remained seated, processing the temporary reprieve she'd been granted. 7 days is not long," she murmured to Thomas. "Time enough for the truth to emerge," he replied cryptically. "Come, Ayoka has arranged shelter for you in her dwelling." They exited the council house into the cool evening air, now filled with the sounds and scents of the village's evening meal preparations. Children's voices called out questions as they passed, quickly hushed by adults. Elizabeth felt herself the center of attention, despite her inability to see the curious eyes following her progress. Ayoka's dwelling proved to be a well-constructed home, larger than Elizabeth had expected, with a central fire pit providing warmth and light. The medicine woman guided Elizabeth's hands to explore the space, helping her create a mental map of her temporary sanctuary. "Here you will sleep," Ayoka explained, showing her a sleeping platform covered with soft furs. "And here your belongings may rest." She indicated a small storage shelf near the bed. "Your kindness overwhelms me," Elizabeth said sincerely. "Why do you welcome me when others are suspicious?" Ayoka was silent for a moment, arranging items around the fire. "I have seen visions of your coming," she said finally. 3 moons ago, when autumn first touched the leaves, the spirits showed me a woman walking between worlds, eyes clouded but spirit clear." Elizabeth's breath caught. "You foresaw me?" "Perhaps," the medicine woman allowed. "Or perhaps one like you." "The spirits seldom speak plainly." She placed a wooden bowl of fragrant stew in Elizabeth's hands. "Eat now. Tomorrow brings new challenges." As Elizabeth ate the unfamiliar but delicious meal, she heard Thomas speaking with Ayoka in low tones by the dwelling's entrance. Though they conversed in Cherokee, the tension in their voices transcended language barriers. "Is something wrong?" she asked when Thomas approached to bid her good night. "Nothing you need concern yourself with tonight," he replied, his usual straightforwardness, softened but still present. "I will return at dawn. Ayoka will remain nearby." "Where will you sleep?" Elizabeth asked, suddenly anxious at the prospect of navigating this new environment without him. "I have my own dwelling," Thomas explained. "Not far, 3 dwellings toward the rising sun." The information was provided in his typical way, practical directions she could use rather than vague reassurance. Elizabeth appreciated it more than she could express. After Thomas departed, Ayoka helped Elizabeth prepare for sleep, showing her where water was kept for washing and guiding her through the unfamiliar nighttime rituals of Cherokee life. The medicine woman spoke little, but her movements communicated efficiency and unexpected gentleness. As Elizabeth settled onto the sleeping platform, wrapped in soft furs against the autumn chill, she found herself overwhelmed by the day's events. From the cave that had become her sanctuary to this village full of strangers, some hostile, some curious, some inexplicably welcoming, her world had expanded and contracted simultaneously. Here, she was safe from wolves and weather, yet vulnerable in new ways. The 7-day reprieve felt both generous and painfully brief. What would happen when that time expired? Would the council send her away? And if so, where? As sleep finally claimed her, Elizabeth's last conscious thought was of Thomas, his steady presence, his unfailing honesty, and the space between their worlds that seemed both unbridgeable and somehow already crossed. Elizabeth woke to unfamiliar sounds, women's voices conversing softly in Cherokee, the rhythmic thud of corn being ground, children laughing as they darted past Ayoka's dwelling. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place herself, the cave and forest momentarily confused with this new reality. "You are awake," Ayoka observed, her steps light as she approached Elizabeth's sleeping platform. "Did the spirits bring you dreams?" Elizabeth sat up, orienting herself to the medicine woman's voice. "I dreamed of crossing water," she admitted, "a wide river with no bridge or boat. Yet somehow I wasn't afraid." Ayoka made a sound of interest. "Water dreams are powerful. They speak of change, of boundaries crossed." She pressed a wooden cup into Elizabeth's hands. "Drink, morning tea with honey and herbs for strength." The tea was aromatic and soothing, unlike anything Elizabeth had tasted before. As she sipped, Ayoka explained the day ahead. "The women have questions about you," she said, matter-of-factly. "They wonder how a blind woman manages without sight. I told them you would show them." Anxiety fluttered in Elizabeth's chest. "Show them what exactly?" "Your skills, your ways of knowing the world." Ayoka's tone suggested this was perfectly reasonable. "They must see you are not helpless, not a burden." Before Elizabeth could formulate a response, Thomas's familiar step sounded outside, followed by his voice requesting entry. Ayoka called permission, and he entered, bringing with him the fresh scent of morning air and pine. "You've rested well?" he inquired, his voice carrying its usual calm assurance. "Yes, though apparently I'm to give demonstrations of blind living today," Elizabeth replied, unable to keep a hint of nervousness from her voice. Thomas seemed to consider this. "The people must know you," he said finally. "Fear comes from not understanding." "And if I fail to impress them?" Elizabeth challenged, setting aside her empty cup. "Be yourself," Thomas advised simply. "No more, no less." After a breakfast of unfamiliar but satisfying corn cakes and dried berries, Elizabeth was led outside to begin what would become one of the strangest days of her life. Women of the village approached, hesitant at first, then with growing boldness, asking questions through Thomas or Ayoka about how she navigated without sight. "How do you know what food is before you?" asked one young mother, her voice curious rather than unkind. "By smell, by touch, sometimes by listening to how it's described," Elizabeth explained, demonstrating by identifying the items in a nearby basket: corn, dried squash, and what she guessed correctly to be hickory nuts. "And your clothing?" Another woman inquired. "How do you choose what to wear?" "I memorize each piece by its texture and weight," Elizabeth explained. "Though I admit, colors are beyond me now, unless someone describes them." As the morning progressed, Elizabeth moved from demonstrating basic skills to actively teaching some of her methods. She showed a group of attentive women how she counted steps between important locations, how she identified people by their footsteps and voices, and how she arranged her belongings in consistent patterns for easy location. To her surprise, the women began offering their own suggestions, clever adaptations she hadn't considered. One elderly weaver demonstrated how particular knitting patterns could be used to mark different containers by touch. Another showed how specific scents, pine, mint, sweetgrass, could be used to distinguish otherwise similar items. "Your people truly value practical knowledge," Elizabeth observed to Thomas during a brief respite. "Survival depends on it," he replied, "and on sharing what is learned." By midday, Elizabeth had graduated from curiosity to something approaching acceptance among the village women. Children still followed her movements with whispered comments, but their initial wariness had transformed into fascination. As they shared the midday meal, Sequoia approached, speaking rapidly to Thomas in Cherokee. The conversation carried tension that Elizabeth could sense even without understanding the words. "What's happened?" she asked when they finished. Thomas hesitated. "Scouts report riders approaching from the direction of Cumberland Ford. 6 men, armed. At least 2 are soldiers." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. "Looking for me?" "Perhaps," Thomas allowed. "Or perhaps routine patrol. Either way, Chief Adahy has ordered preparations." "What kind of preparations?" Elizabeth asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "Women and children gather in houses, warriors to defensive positions. He paused. "You must be hidden." Before Elizabeth could respond, Ayoka joined them, speaking urgently in Cherokee. After a brief exchange, Thomas turned back to Elizabeth. "Come." Quickly, he took her arm, guiding her away from the central village area. Their pace was swift, forcing Elizabeth to trust his guidance completely as they navigated between dwellings. "Where are we going?" she asked, struggling to keep her footing on the unfamiliar terrain. "Grandmother Galilahi's dwelling," Thomas explained, tersely. "It sits apart from others, less likely to be searched, and she is respected. Soldiers might hesitate to disturb an elder." They reached the dwelling minutes later, Thomas announcing their arrival in Cherokee. A creaking voice responded, granting entry. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of herbs and smoke, warmer than Ahioka's home, and somehow more ancient. "So," Grandmother Galilahi said in her accented English, "the blind woman brings trouble to our door already." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth began, but the elderly woman interrupted with a dry chuckle. "When has truth ever needed an apology? Sit. Both of you. What comes will come." Thomas guided Elizabeth to a sitting mat before speaking in rapid Cherokee with the grandmother. Their conversation was brief but intense, ending with Thomas addressing Elizabeth again. "I must join the warriors," he explained. "You will remain here with grandmother. Do exactly as she instructs." "Thomas," Elizabeth caught his arm as he prepared to leave, sudden fear gripping her. "If they're looking for me, perhaps I should simply go with them." "Prevent any conflict." His hand covered hers briefly. "We do not yet know their purpose, and those who abandoned you once may have reasons beyond concern for doing so again." With that cryptic warning, he was gone, leaving Elizabeth alone with the ancient grandmother. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional snap of the central fire. "You care for Waya Unole," Grandmother Galilahi observed suddenly. "Your voice changes when you speak to him." Heat rushed to Elizabeth's cheeks. "He saved my life. He's been kind when others were not." The old woman hummed noncommittally. "Kindness and love are different rivers, though they sometimes flow together." Before Elizabeth could respond to this uncomfortably perceptive observation, distant voices carried from the village centre. English voices, demanding and authoritative, met with measured Cherokee responses. "They come, grandmother," Galilahi said unnecessarily. Now we listen. The next hour passed with excruciating slowness. Elizabeth strained to hear what was happening, catching only fragments of conversations, raised voices, occasional commands, the constant translation between English and Cherokee. "What are they saying?" she asked finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer. "They search for a missing woman," Grandmother replied. "Offer payment for information. Speak of treaty obligations." Elizabeth's hands clenched in her lap. "And our peoples." Response? The old woman chuckled at her use of "our people," but answered directly. "Chief Adahi tells them no white woman has come to the village. Offers them food, suggesting a storm may have carried missing one to the river." A new thought struck Elizabeth, with chilling clarity. What if they search the dwellings? "They will not find you," Grandmother Galilahi stated with absolute certainty. "Come." To Elizabeth's astonishment, the elderly woman led her to what felt like a small opening in the dwelling's rear wall, concealed behind hanging furs. "Crawl through," she instructed. "Storage pit beneath, used during harsh winters and troubled times." Elizabeth obeyed, ducking through the opening and lowering herself into a shallow pit lined with fragrant cedar. Grandmother Galilahi passed down a fur to cover her, then began to rearrange items above, creating, Elizabeth realized, a concealed hiding place that would appear to be simple storage. "Be still as stone," the grandmother advised before moving. A way to reseal the entrance. Elizabeth huddled in the darkness, no different to her blind eyes, but somehow more complete in its isolation. Time lost meaning as she waited, every sound from above magnified by fear and uncertainty. Footsteps eventually approached the dwelling. Heavy boots, unlike the softer tread of moccasins. Male voices spoke in English, asking questions that Grandmother Galilahi answered in deliberately broken, halting responses. "Old woman alone," she told them. "No white woman here, only herbs, medicines." A man's voice responded with barely concealed impatience. "We have authority to search all dwellings in the village. Step aside." Elizabeth held her breath as footsteps entered the dwelling, moving about with little regard for the sanctity of the space. She could hear items being shifted, furs thrown aside, containers opened. "What's this?" a different voice demanded. "Winter food," Grandmother Galilahi replied calmly. "Roots, dried meat, corn. Old women must prepare for cold moons." The search continued for what felt like eternity, boots passing directly over Elizabeth's hiding place more than once. Finally, a disgusted voice declared, "Nothing here, just an old squaw's junk." The insult brought no response from Grandmother Galilahi, though Elizabeth felt a surge of indignation on her behalf. The footsteps retreated, accompanied by a final warning about treaty obligations and harboring fugitives. Only when silence had reigned for many minutes did the hidden entrance reopen, Grandmother Galilahi's weathered hands reaching down to help Elizabeth emerge from her hiding place. "They are gone?" Elizabeth asked, brushing dust from her skirts. "From this dwelling, yes. They are still searching for others." The grandmother's voice carried a weariness that hadn't been present before. "Men who seek you speak with forked tongues. They call you cherished daughter and poor lost woman, yet their eyes hold other purposes." Elizabeth absorbed this troubling assessment. "Did you recognize any of them? Was William Pierce among them?" "I know not these names," Grandmother Galilahi replied, "but one man wore fine cloth, not soldier clothes. His hands were soft, unused to work. He offered most gold for finding you." A chill ran through Elizabeth. William had never had soft hands, always priding himself on working his land alongside his hired men. Who, then, searched for her with such determination? And more importantly, why? Evening descended on the village with an unnatural quiet. The usual sounds of community life, children playing, women calling to one another, men returning from hunting, were muted, as if the entire settlement held its breath. Elizabeth remained in Grandmother Galilahi's dwelling, the old woman refusing to let her return to Ahyoka's home until she deemed it safe. "Soldiers circle like vultures," the grandmother explained, stoking her small fire. "They make camp at the forest edge, say they return tomorrow." Elizabeth's anxiety deepened with this news. "They won't simply leave, not until they find what they seek," Grandmother Galilahi replied. "Or who?" Heavy footsteps approached the dwelling. Too heavy for Thomas, Elizabeth realized with a flutter of alarm. But Grandmother Galilahi seemed unconcerned, calling out welcome in Cherokee. Chief Adahi entered, his presence filling the small space with authority. He spoke briefly with Grandmother in their language before addressing Elizabeth directly. "The men who search for you are persistent," he said, his English deliberate but clear. "They offer a lot of gold, speak of reward for your safe return." Elizabeth's hands twisted in her lap. "I don't understand why they would offer a reward for someone they deliberately abandoned." "Perhaps this is a question you should ask," the chief suggested. "The leader of these men waits at the forest edge. He asks to speak with any who might have seen blind woman from a settler caravan." "A trap, surely. If I go to him, they'll simply—" "Take me?" Elizabeth protested. "Not if Cherokee warriors stand with you," Chief Adahi replied. "I have consulted with the council. We believe truth must be known before decisions can be made." Thomas arrived as they were discussing the chief's proposal, his familiar stride bringing unexpected comfort to Elizabeth. He conferred briefly with the others before kneeling beside her. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "the man who leads the search party is not your cousin's husband. He gives his name as Edward Blackwood and says he represents Virginia Banking Trust." The name struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. "Blackwood?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's impossible." "You know this man?" Thomas asked, his voice sharpening. Elizabeth nodded slowly, pieces falling into a terrifying place. "Edward Blackwood was my father's banker. He handled our estate after my parents died." Her voice strengthened as connections clarified in her. "A mind. He's the one who advised William to sell our land and go west, said it would fetch better price after we'd gone." Thomas was silent for a moment, absorbing this information. "Why would such a man track you through the wilderness?" "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted. "Unless—" She paused, a terrible suspicion forming. "Unless there was something valuable on that land, something he didn't want us to discover." Chief Adahi and Grandmother Galilahi listened to this exchange intently. The chief spoke in Cherokee to Thomas, who replied at length, occasionally gesturing toward Elizabeth. "What are you telling him?" she asked. "That deeper game is being played," Thomas answered. "We must learn our true purpose before deciding your fate." After further discussion, a plan emerged. Elizabeth would meet with Blackwood, not at the forest edge where his men waited, but on neutral ground between the village and their camp. She would be accompanied by Thomas, 2 warriors, and surprisingly, Grandmother Galilahi, whose status as an elder might provide additional protection. "I will gauge this man's heart," the old woman declared. "Eyes can lie, voice cannot, not to those who truly listen." They set out at dawn, the air crisp with early frost. Elizabeth wore a deerskin cape over her settler dress, her hair arranged in the Cherokee style by Ahyoka, a deliberate blending of appearances that Thomas had suggested might unsettle Blackwood. "Remember," Thomas murmured as they approached, "the meeting place. Reveal nothing of cave or how long you've been with us. Let him believe we found you recently." Elizabeth nodded, her mouth dry with apprehension. The walking stick Ahyoka had gifted her, carved with symbols she couldn't see but could feel beneath her fingers, provided both practical support and psychological comfort. They reached the clearing first, positioning themselves strategically. Thomas described the layout to Elizabeth in whispered detail. Open ground before them, forest path behind, large oak to their left where 2 warriors would remain partially concealed. "They come," one of the warriors announced quietly. 5 men, 2 with guns ready. Elizabeth squared her shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed weeks earlier. Thomas stood close beside her, his presence steadying. "Miss Morgan," a familiar voice called, cultured, educated, with the polished accent of Richmond society. "My dear girl, what a relief to find you alive." "Mr. Blackwood," Elizabeth acknowledged. Coolly, "You seem to have gone to extraordinary lengths to locate me." Footsteps approached, cautious, measuring. "When we heard the Pierce family arrived at Cumberland Settlement without you, I organized a search party immediately. They claimed you were swept away in the storm, presumed dead." "How convenient for them," Elizabeth observed, "and how generous of you to mount such an extensive rescue effort." She could almost hear Blackwood's smile in his response, the same oily charm he'd employed when handling her father's affairs. "Your father was a dear friend, Miss Morgan. I consider it my duty to ensure his daughter's well-being." Thomas shifted, subtly beside her, and Elizabeth knew he'd detected the lie. Her father had despised Blackwood, referring to him privately as that banking vulture. "Strange," Elizabeth remarked. "I don't recall you showing such concern when William Pierce took me from my home and sold my family's land on your recommendation." A momentary silence suggested her direct approach had caught Blackwood off guard. When he spoke again, his voice had hardened slightly. "The Pierces were your legal guardians after your unfortunate affliction. The sale was entirely proper. And yet here you are, Mr. Blackwood, deep in Cherokee territory with armed men, offering substantial rewards for a blind woman you previously helped dispatch to the frontier." Elizabeth tilted her head. "One might wonder why." Blackwood's voice moved, closer, dropping to what he clearly intended as a sympathetic tone. "My dear, you've clearly suffered a terrible ordeal. These savages have shown me more kindness than my own blood relations," Elizabeth interrupted sharply. "They found me half dead and nursed me back to health. They've taught me to survive, despite my blindness." "And we are grateful for their assistance," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Which will, of course, be rewarded, but now it's time to return you to civilization." Grandmother Galilahi spoke suddenly in Cherokee. Thomas translated for Elizabeth. "She says this man's heart beats fast like a frightened rabbit. He fears something more than being concerned for your welfare." Taking courage from the grandmother's assessment, Elizabeth pressed further. "Before I consider going anywhere, Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you could satisfy my curiosity. What did you find on our land after we departed? What discovery was valuable enough to send armed men after a blind woman?" The silence that followed carried a weight of its own. When Blackwood finally spoke, his voice had shed its veneer of concern. "I see these heathens have filled your head with suspicious notions. Your father's property was sold legally, the transactions properly recorded. If you return with us now, you'll be treated with every comfort. If you refuse..." A dangerous edge entered his tone. Well, a blind woman lost in the wilderness would be a tragedy, but hardly surprising. Thomas moved protectively closer to Elizabeth, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood?" "I'm merely pointing out the realities of your situation," he replied coldly. "The Cherokee harboring a white woman could face serious consequences. Military intervention, perhaps. How many lives are you willing to risk for your suspicions?" The threat against the village struck Elizabeth more deeply than any danger to herself. These people had protected her, taught her, accepted her, despite the risks. She would not bring destruction upon them. Before she could respond, Grandmother Galilahi spoke again, Longer this time. Thomas listened intently before translating. She says, "Tell the lying snake that Galilahi has lived 90 winters and seen white man's greed poison the land like bad water. Tell him she has dreamed of yellow metal beneath Morgan land and seen visions of men digging by night. Tell him his secrets are known to the spirits who have whispered them to the blind one's protectors." The grandmother's words, pure intuition or remarkable insight, struck their target with precision. Blackwood's next breath came as a sharp intake, audible even to Elizabeth. "Gold," she whispered, suddenly understanding dawning. "There was gold on our property." "Ridiculous," Blackwood snapped, but his voice had risen in pitch, betraying his anxiety. "These primitive superstitions were enough to rattle you considerably," Elizabeth observed. "My father always said our stream had unusual coloured sands. He thought it merely pretty. But you suspected, didn't you? You arranged our removal, then confirmed your suspicions after we'd gone." A tense silence fell over the clearing. Elizabeth could feel the shifting dynamics. Blackwood's men restless, the Cherokee warriors alert to every movement. "You have no proof," Blackwood said finally, calculation replacing panic in his tone. "And no judge would take the word of a blind woman and her savage companions over a respected banker." "Perhaps not," Elizabeth conceded. "But proof can be gathered. Questions asked, enough doubt raised to warrant investigation." She smiled thinly. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to explain to the authorities why you pursued me with armed men into Cherokee territory." The standoff stretched between them, neither side willing to yield. Finally, Thomas spoke in English, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "The woman stays with Cherokee until the truth is settled. You go now, return to settlement. No soldiers, no more searching." "Or what?" Blackwood challenged. "Or word spreads," Elizabeth interjected. "To Cumberland settlement, to Virginia, to anyone who might wonder why Edward Blackwood is so desperate to silence a blind woman." The implicit threat hung in the air between them. Elizabeth could almost feel Blackwood calculating his options, weighing risks against potential rewards. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice cold with fury. "No one threatens my reputation. No one threatens my life," Elizabeth countered steadily. "We understand each other perfectly, Mr. Blackwood." With that, the confrontation ended, not in victory for either side, but in uneasy stalemate. As Blackwood and his men retreated, Elizabeth released a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "He will return," Thomas said quietly. "Men driven by gold rarely abandon pursuit." Elizabeth nodded, the gravity of her situation settling more firmly upon her shoulders. "Then we must be prepared when he does." The village council gathered that evening in unprecedented urgency. Elizabeth sat beside Thomas near the central fire of the council house, the heat warming her face as voices debated in Cherokee around her. Though she couldn't understand the words, the tones conveyed the gravity of the situation: concern, anger, strategic calculation. Thomas translated key points in hushed whispers. "Some believe Blackwood will bring soldiers. Others think he will not risk exposing his true purpose." "And the chief?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "What does he believe?" "That trouble comes regardless of what we do now," Thomas replied. "The question is how to meet it." The debate continued late into the night, periodically shifting to English when questions were directed to Elizabeth. She answered truthfully, explaining what she knew of Blackwood's connections, his influence in Virginia, and the legal complexity of her situation. "I have no proof of what he's done," she admitted when directly questioned by an elder. "Only suspicions and his reaction to grandmother's words." "Sometimes reaction tells more truth than carefully chosen words," the elder observed. As the council neared its conclusion, Chief Adahi posed a question that silenced the gathered members. Thomas hesitated before translating. He asks where your loyalty lies now, he explained carefully. With your own people, or with those who saved you? The question struck Elizabeth with unexpected force. A month ago, the answer would have seemed obvious. Despite her abandonment, she remained a white settler woman, bound to her culture and society by birth and upbringing. But now, my loyalty, she said slowly, lies with those who treated me as a person of worth, not as a burden to be discarded or a possession to be controlled. She lifted her chin. The Cherokee have shown me more humanity than those of my own blood. I would not bring harm to this village. Her answer prompted murmured responses, some approving, others clearly skeptical. Chief Adahi spoke again, longer this time. The chief says, "You have been granted 7 days among us," Thomas translated. 3 have passed. The council extends this to 14 days, during which we will prepare for whatever comes. You will remain under protection, but also under watch. Elizabeth nodded her acceptance. "Thank you for your trust, limited though it may be." As the council dispersed, Thomas guided Elizabeth back toward Ahyoka's dwelling, now deemed safe enough for her return. The night air carried a sharp chill, the first true breath of approaching winter. "Do you truly mean what you told the council?" Thomas asked unexpectedly. "About your loyalties?" Elizabeth considered her answer carefully. "I've spent my life being defined by others, first as a gentleman's daughter, then as a blind burden, now as a valuable pawn in Blackwood's schemes. Here among your people, I've begun to define myself." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "So, yes, I meant every word." Thomas was silent for several steps. When he spoke again, his voice carried an emotion she hadn't heard before. Not quite. Vulnerability, but something equally rare for him. "The path between worlds is difficult," he said quietly. "I would not wish it on anyone. Yet I find myself—" He trailed off, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Find yourself what?" Elizabeth prompted. "Gently. Glad that you walk it with me," he finished simply. The words settled between them, significant but undemanding. Elizabeth felt her cheeks warm despite the cold night air. The next morning brought a flurry of activity throughout the village. Thomas arrived early, explaining that scouts had reported Blackwood and his men had indeed departed toward Cumberland settlement, but preparations for their likely return were already underway. "The chief has assigned tasks to everyone," he explained. "Food stores secured, escape routes prepared, weapons readied." His tone remained practical, but Elizabeth detected underlying tension. "You also have tasks." "Me?" Elizabeth couldn't hide her surprise. "What could I possibly contribute?" "Knowledge," Thomas answered. "Blackwood is your people's snake, not ours. You understand his thinking, his ways. Ahyoka and Grandmother Galilahi wish to speak with you about him." The meeting took place in Grandmother's dwelling, the space now familiar to Elizabeth after her time hiding there. The elderly woman began without preamble, speaking through Thomas's translation. "Tell us of this gold seeker's power. Who stands with him? Who is above him?" Elizabeth considered carefully. "Blackwood has connections throughout Virginia. Other bankers, lawmakers, military officers. He presents himself as respectable, his word trusted by those in authority." She frowned, thinking deeper. "But he's also careful. He wouldn't have come himself unless the stakes were extraordinarily high." "Gold makes men forget caution," Ahyoka observed. "Not just any gold," Elizabeth realized, thinking aloud. "If it were a small deposit, he would have simply claimed it legally. This must be significant, worth the risk of pursuing me, worth the potential scandal." Grandmother Galilahi spoke at length in Cherokee, her wrinkled hands gesturing emphatically. Thomas listened before turning to Elizabeth. She says her vision showed men digging by night, many men, wagons leaving heavy burden. This has happened for weeks already. The implications struck Elizabeth forcefully. He's been extracting gold, secretly, probably using hired men sworn to secrecy. That's why he can't afford any legal challenges or investigations. He's been stealing what should have belonged to my family, or at least been properly claimed and taxed. How would you prove this? Ayoka asked practically. Elizabeth's hands twisted in her lap, frustration evident. That's the problem. Without sight, without legal standing, without access to the property, I have no way to gather evidence. The conversation continued, circling possibilities and limitations. By midday, Elizabeth felt exhausted by the mental exertion, yet no closer to a solution that might protect both her and the village. As they prepared to leave grandmother's dwelling, the elderly woman suddenly grasped Elizabeth's hand, her papery skin surprisingly strong in its grip. She spoke directly in her accented English. "Vision comes not just through eyes," she said firmly. "You see more than you know, blind one. Truth hides in darkness, waiting for the right moment to emerge." The cryptic statement lingered in Elizabeth's mind as she and Thomas walked through the village. Children's voices called out greetings now, some even daring to approach and touch her skirts before darting away, giggling. "They've given you a Cherokee name," Thomas mentioned, amusement coloring his voice. "Tsula Galiagina, fox who listens. They say you hear what others miss." The nickname brought an unexpected smile to Elizabeth's face. "I'm honored," she said, "sincerely, though I wish my listening had provided better answers today." "Answers come when needed, not when demanded," Thomas replied philosophically. "For now, there are other lessons waiting." The other lessons proved to be practical defense training, techniques Thomas insisted Elizabeth learn in case of emergency. He taught her how to identify the direction of approaching footsteps, how to use her walking stick as a defensive weapon if necessary, and most importantly, how to navigate escape routes from the village by memory alone. "Remember," he instructed as they traced a path leading to a sheltered cave system behind the village, 14 steps from split oak to stone outcropping, then turn toward the morning sun and count 23 steps to the hidden path. Elizabeth committed each direction to memory, her mental map expanding to encompass potential salvation. As they practiced, a thought occurred to her. "Thomas, could someone from the village reach my family's land in Virginia? Not to confront Blackwood, but to observe. To confirm what grandmother saw in her vision." Thomas considered this. Possible, but dangerous. Cherokee traveling alone through settler territories risks death or capture. "What about you?" Elizabeth suggested. "You navigate both worlds. You could pass as a guide or hunter." His silence told her he'd already considered this possibility. "The journey would take weeks," he said finally. "You would remain vulnerable here." "I'm safer with your people than anywhere else," Elizabeth countered. "And if we could gather proof of Blackwood's illegal mining, we could use it to negotiate protection for the village. How would a blind woman present such evidence to authorities?" Thomas asked, not unkindly, but realistically. Elizabeth squared her shoulders. "I may be blind, but I'm still a gentleman's daughter. There are those in Virginia who would listen. My father's former legal advisor, perhaps, or the governor's secretary who always showed him respect." She paused, thinking, and if Blackwood has been avoiding taxation on his mining operation, the territorial authorities would have significant interest. Thomas remained silent, weighing her words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried reluctant admiration. "You think like both fox and wolf now, clever and determined. I will speak with the chief about your suggestion." That evening, as Elizabeth sat with Ayoka learning to weave a special kind of water-resistant basket, she found herself contemplating the strange turns her life had taken. A month ago, she had been a passive passenger in her own existence, carried along by others' decisions. Now she strategized, planned, and advocated, not just for herself, but for an entire community that had changed from strangers to defenders in remarkably short time. "Your hands grow skilled," Ayoka observed, guiding Elizabeth's fingers over a particularly complicated weaving pattern. "I've had good teachers," Elizabeth replied. "In more ways than basket-making," Ayoka hummed thoughtfully. "When the storm first brought you to us, I wondered what purpose spirits had. Now I begin to see design in what seemed like an accident." Elizabeth's fingers stilled on the basket. "What design do you see?" "Bridge builder," the medicine woman said simply. "One who stands between worlds must sometimes build a way for others to cross." As night settled over the village and Elizabeth prepared for sleep, Ayoka's words echoed in her mind. Bridge builder. The role suggested something more permanent than temporary refuge, more purposeful than mere survival. For the first time since the storm that had altered her path so dramatically, Elizabeth allowed herself to imagine a future, uncertain and challenging, but her own to shape. If that future somehow included Thomas, the village, and a life built on her own terms rather than others' limitations, perhaps the storm had blown her toward salvation rather than destruction after all. 3 days passed in watchful preparation. The village existed in a state of heightened alertness. Hunters traveled in pairs, children played closer to dwellings, and night watches doubled their vigilance. Thomas spent these days alternating between scouting missions and council meetings, returning to Elizabeth each evening with updates and new defensive strategies. On the 4th day after Blackwood's departure, Thomas approached Elizabeth as she worked with Ayoka, sorting medicinal herbs by scent and texture. "The chief has decided," he announced without preamble. "I will journey to your family's land in Virginia. 2 warriors will accompany me part of the way." Elizabeth's hands stilled on the herbs. "When will you leave?" "Tomorrow at dawn." His voice carried resignation mixed with determination. "The journey will take at least 3 weeks, perhaps longer if winter comes early." The prospect of such separation struck Elizabeth with unexpected force. In the short time she had known Thomas, he had become her anchor, her guide, through both physical darkness and cultural unfamiliarity. "Who will—" she began, then stopped herself, unwilling to sound helpless or dependent. Thomas seemed to understand her unspoken concern. "Sequoia will oversee your protection. He has changed his mind about you." A note of approval entered his voice. "He says anyone who stands against Blackwood cannot be entirely without merit." Despite her anxiety, Elizabeth smiled at this backhanded compliment. High praise indeed. That evening, the village gathered for a ceremony blessing Thomas's journey. Elizabeth sat beside Grandmother Galilahi, listening as prayers and songs rose. Into the night air, the unfamiliar Cherokee words, carrying power even without translation. After the ceremony, Thomas sought Elizabeth out. "Walk with me," he requested quietly. He led her to a small clearing at the village edge, a place she recognized by the distinctive sound of wind through a stand of young pines. They stood in silence for several moments, the night alive with autumn sounds around them. "If I don't return," Thomas began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "Ayoka will ensure your safety. The chief has granted you protection regardless of the outcome. You'll return," Elizabeth said firmly, surprising herself with her certainty. "The world between your people and mine grows more dangerous each season," Thomas replied. "Nothing is guaranteed." Elizabeth reached out instinctively, her hand finding his arm in the darkness. "Then take this," she said, removing the small deerskin pouch that contained her mother's Bible, the last possession from her previous life that held true meaning. "A reminder of your promise to return." Thomas accepted the token, his fingers briefly covering hers. "I have something for you as well." He pressed a small object into her palm, cool, smooth stone, carved into what her exploring fingers identified as a fox. "Tsula Galiagina," he explained, "fox who listens. I carved it during night watches." Elizabeth closed her fingers around the token, deeply moved by the unexpected gift. "I'll listen for your return every day," she promised. The moment stretched. Between them, filled with words neither seemed ready to speak, finally Thomas broke the silence. "There is something I must ask," he said, his voice lowering. "If evidence is found, if Blackwood's crimes are proven, what then? Would you return to your world?" The question caught Elizabeth unprepared, though in retrospect it had been inevitable. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "A month ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now, Thomas prompted when she didn't continue. "Now I understand there are different kinds of blindness," Elizabeth said carefully. "My eyes may not see, but among your people I've learned to perceive in ways I never imagined possible. I've found value beyond what my former world would allow me." She turned to face him more directly, though she couldn't see his expression. "What would happen if I chose to stay? Would the village accept such a thing?" "Some would," Thomas replied. "Others would not. The path between worlds is never easy." He paused before adding quietly, "But it is not a path that must be walked alone." The implication hung in the air between them, not quite a declaration but an opening, a possibility that Elizabeth found both terrifying and exhilarating. "Return safely," she said simply. "We will speak of paths when you do." Dawn arrived with a bitter chill, frost coating the ground as Thomas and his companions prepared to depart. The village gathered to witness their leaving, solemn faces reflecting the gravity of the mission. Elizabeth stood with Ayoka and grandmother Galilahi, the carved fox clutched tightly in her hand. Thomas approached to bid them farewell, speaking briefly with the medicine woman and elder before turning to Elizabeth. "Remember what I taught you," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "Trust your senses. The forest speaks to those who truly listen." "I will," Elizabeth promised. "And Thomas—" She hesitated, then finished simply, "May your path be clear." His hand briefly touched her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance, of connection, before he turned away. Elizabeth listened to his retreating footsteps until they faded into the forest sounds, taking with them a piece of her newly awakened heart. The days that followed established a new rhythm. Elizabeth divided her time between learning tribal crafts, helping Ayoka with medicinal preparations, and continuing her defensive training with Sequoia. To her surprise, the young warrior proved to be a patient teacher, pushing her capabilities, without belittling her limitations. "You move more like Cherokee now," he observed one afternoon as she navigated a challenging forest path without assistance. "Less like a settler woman afraid of the earth beneath her feet." Elizabeth accepted the compliment with quiet pride. The earth has much to teach when one stops fearing it. On the 10th day after Thomas's departure, the first snow fell, earlier than expected, blanketing the village in hushed whiteness. Elizabeth stood outside Ayoka's dwelling, feeling the delicate flakes dissolve against her upturned face. "Winter comes quickly this year," Ayoka observed, joining her. "The journey will be harder." Elizabeth nodded, concerned about tightening around her heart. Will they turn back? "Waya Unole does not abandon a path once chosen," the medicine woman replied with certainty. "He will continue regardless of the season." As the snow deepened over the following days, Elizabeth found herself drawn to grandmother Galilai's dwelling, seeking the elder's company and wisdom. The grandmother welcomed these visits, often sharing stories that bridged Cherokee history and personal reminiscence. "In my youth," she told Elizabeth one evening as they sat beside her fire, "Cherokee and settlers sometimes lived in peace, traded, learned from each other, even married." Her voice carried a wistful quality. Before greed poisoned everything, could such days return? Elizabeth asked, turning the carved fox in her hands, a habit she'd developed in Thomas's absence. Grandmother Galilahi was silent for a long moment. "Perhaps," she said finally, "but only if bridge builders on both sides prove stronger than wall makers." On the 17th day of Thomas's absence, a day of clear, biting cold, Sequoia burst into the council house where Elizabeth sat learning tribal governance from an elder. "Riders approach," he announced tensely. "Many, armed." Elizabeth rose immediately, her heart racing. "Blackwood?" "Yes," Sequoia confirmed. "And soldiers, more than before." The village erupted into coordinated activity, women gathering children, warriors taking defensive positions, elders securing sacred items. Elizabeth found herself swept along to Grandmother Galilahi's dwelling, where the hidden storage pit had been prepared once again. "No," she said firmly, resisting Ayoka's attempt to guide her toward the hiding place. "I won't hide this time." Blind. Women against armed men is foolish courage, Sequoia argued, arriving to ensure their safety. Elizabeth stood her ground. "This confrontation is because of me. I won't cower while others face danger on my behalf." After a heated debate, a compromise was reached. Elizabeth would remain in Grandmother's dwelling, not hidden, but not immediately visible. If Blackwood demanded to see her, the decision would be hers whether to emerge. From her position just inside the dwelling, Elizabeth listened as horses approached. Men's voices called out demands, and Chief Adahi responded with dignified restraint. The exchange quickly grew hostile. "We know you're harboring Elizabeth Morgan against her will." Blackwood's voice rang out clearly. "Produce her immediately or face the consequences." The chief's reply was measured but firm. "No one is held against their will in Cherokee village. Your accusations dishonor both our peoples. I have orders to search every dwelling in this illegal a settlement," a new voice announced. "Authoritative military. Resistance will be considered hostile action against the United States." Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists. Blackwood had done exactly as Thomas predicted, returned with official sanction, using her as pretext for what might become violence against the entire village. She rose to her feet. Decision made. "I'm going out there," she told Ayoka firmly. "They will take you," the medicine woman warned. "Perhaps," Elizabeth agreed, "but I'll go on my terms, not theirs." Stepping out of the dwelling, Elizabeth moved forward with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, despite her blindness. Her walking stick tapped rhythmically against the frozen ground, creating a sound that gradually silenced the confrontation ahead. "Mr. Blackwood," she called out clearly, her voice carrying in the winter air, "I understand you've been looking for me. Again." She sensed rather than heard the shift in attention as all eyes turned toward her. Standing tall, the carved fox secure. In her pocket and Thomas's lessons firm in her mind, Elizabeth prepared to face whatever came next, not as a victim or a burden, but as a woman who had found her strength in the darkness. "Miss Morgan," Blackwood replied, a false concern dripping from his voice, "thank heavens we've found you. These savages rescued me when my so-called guardians abandoned me to die," Elizabeth interrupted smoothly, "and have shown me nothing but kindness since." She turned slightly, addressing the military officer she presumed accompanied Blackwood. "Captain, I assume you've been told I'm being held against my will?" A moment of silence followed, before the officer responded, confusion evident in his tone. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Blackwood has sworn affidavits from your cousin's family, the same family that left me alone in a storm because my blindness inconvenienced them," Elizabeth cut in sharply. "How fortunate they've suddenly developed such concern." For my welfare, she took another step forward, her walking stick finding solid ground. I remain with the Cherokee by choice, sir. And I would suggest you consider why a respected banker would bring armed men to retrieve a blind woman whose family has already declared her dead. The standoff that followed hung on a knife's edge. Blackwood's sputtered denials, the officers' hesitation, the Cherokee warriors poised for whatever might come. Elizabeth stood her ground, her blindness paradoxically giving her strength. Without visual distractions, she focused entirely on the sounds around her, the subtle shifts in position, the changing rhythms of breath that betrayed intention. As winter sunlight warmed her face, Elizabeth Morgan made her choice, not merely for the moment, but for the life that awaited beyond it. Whatever came next, she would face it, standing firmly on the path she had chosen for herself, guided by lessons learned in darkness and a promise carried on the winter wind. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.